So today I'm going to look at the ARRI 16S, and we'll also talk a little bit about its sister camera, which is the 16M, and the differences between them, and some of the accessories and how to use the camera and what it's good for. This is an MOS camera. That's German for mit-out sound, meaning shooting without sync sound. For most applications it's too noisy, but maybe outdoors at a distance it could work well, especially with a crystal motor, which would keep it exactly on sync. This particular camera, the 16S, was developed in the 1950s, and it was the first pin-registered professional 16mm camera. And what that means is that it has a mirror shutter in it, which allows the operator to see exactly what they're shooting through the mirror, and then the mirror moves and exposes the film, and it just keeps rotating. So this was one of the first cameras that had that concept built into it. It was also pin registered, which means that there's a registration pin. This is actually a movement which was taken out of one of the cameras, and there's a registration pin that moves in and out that holds the film rock steady during exposure. So this was a new development in the world of 16mm movies, which prior to that time, prior to the 1950s, 16mm was basically an amateur format. There were probably Bolex cameras that some people used in harsh conditions, but a lot of the cameras that were available at that time were spring-wound cameras and didn't have electric motors. And so the Arriflex camera was one of the first that also had a electric drive motor to it. The particular motor that's on this camera was one of the last ones made for this camera, and it's a crystal motor, which allows you to shoot at exactly at 24 frames per second for sound or for synchronizing with lights, etc. And it also allows you to shoot variable speeds with the same camera. Let's just look at some of the features real quick on what this camera has and how they can be used. Let's start at the front with the turret. Back in the day when this was invented in the 1950s, zoom lenses were just kind of in their infancy, and so zoom lenses weren't very popular or available at that time. So Arriflex put a turret on this, which allows you to move quickly a lens into position, so you could stack it up with a medium, a wide, and a telephoto lens. This is a 25mm Cooke lens, which is made pretty much specifically for this and the 16M cameras. And later on in the development of this camera, Arriflex came up with a more robust design for the front lens mount, and it's a bayonet mount made of stainless steel. So some of the later models are actually called Arriflex 16SBs, and the B stands for bayonet. The bayonet mount was actually made for lenses like this, which were zoom lenses, and they were heavier, so the bayonet mount did a better job of supporting a heavier lens, which is why they added it to their later cameras. But each socket in here also takes an Arriflex standard mount lens. Put that back in there. So that's the lens part of the camera. Let's look around the back. And on the back you see the eyepiece, and this eyepiece was fixed. However, in this particular model, which is a later model, it had a removable eyepiece, so you could actually add a periscope finder or an alternate type of eyepiece if it fit onto the camera. So that was kind of nifty. And so you'll see there's a bunch of different iterations of this camera. Some of them have an old style viewfinder on them. Some of them have a new style viewfinder. But one of the things that makes the viewfinder kind of interesting is that the ground glass that's used for focusing the camera is actually at the back here, close to the viewfinder. And there's a prism and optics that project the image back here. So that's actually where the critical focus distancing and so forth is set in this particular camera. On this back side, you'll see there's a tachometer, which allows you to see what speed you're running at. So you want to make sure if you have a 24 frames per second motor that the camera is actually running at exactly 24 frames per second. There's also a footage and a frame counter on here. Lots of people used to use these cameras for animation, so it was kind of important to know what frame number you were on. Actually, when you're using the standard 100-foot load in this camera, there's no other way to see where your footage is at, so you zero that out, and then you can tell when you're getting near the end of the 100-foot roll. This particular motor back here also has a Fisher 11-pin socket on it, which allows you to plug in very precise speed controls for monitors or what have you. So you can actually run the camera, for example, at 60 frames per second in Crystal Sync, which allows you to use LED lights or HMI lights, which have some of which, if the camera's not running in crystal control, will actually flicker because there's a slight variation in the speed from one moment to another. So that's the motor viewfinder. And the motor, incidentally, one other thing is that you can pop this motor out and you can replace it. And there's like a little rubber cup inside which holds the motor in place. So in the field, the operator could actually take the motor out and replace it, which was pretty useful for, and there were different motors that, you know, for Crystal Sync, different high-speed motors, different constant speed motors. So Arriflex made a bunch of different motors for this camera as well. Let's look inside. This little turn knob here, and you'll see the whole side of the camera comes off. This is actually kind of interesting. The downside to this is that all the optics, including the ground glass, is actually in this door. So if the door is not mounted correctly, or there's some variation in the fit of the door, that actually will affect the your focus on your picture. So that's one thing you want to make sure that the door seats correctly, and also that the light seal on the door is good. This camera, as I had mentioned, was the first 16mm camera, this and its sister camera, the 16M, that used the registration pin. And it's the little pressure plate there. And you can see when I open this up that there's a registration pin in there, and the film would be fed through here and then into the sprockets. And usually, if you're just using this camera, you'd use a 100-foot spool and feed it from this side through the gate and then over to this side. The great thing about these cameras, though, is that Arriflex realized that some people wanted to use 400-foot magazine loads with them, so they put this little hatch in the top, and you can actually put a 400-foot magazine on here. The only downside to that is, number one, the camera profile gets kind of odd, and you can't really handhold it because it's so big. And the other downside to that is that it would require a what they call a torque motor, which is actually a separate motor on the magazine that drives the film. So then you have to worry about the torque motor connecting correctly, and also voltage for the camera. This camera usually ran with the standard motor, usually ran with 8 volts, and this particular camera, because of the crystal motor on it, runs at 12 volts. So you can't just pick up a 400-foot mag. You have to make sure that the motor has either been converted to 12 volts or is an original 12-volt motor, which Arriflex made in the later years of this particular camera manufacturing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about loading the film in this camera. Normally, when you're not using the external magazine, you'd use a 100-foot spool, and they call them daylight spools, so that the film, you only pull out what you need, and the film, you can do this in very subdued light, and then that way you can see what you're doing, because the film is protected because it's around a black spool. But to see what we're doing and to make it easier to visualize, I'm just going to do this with a film on a core, and I'm going to put this on the top and drop that down. Then this is a collapsible core, which I'm going to use as my take-up device. Collapsible cores are actually really nice because it's very easy to get the film on them. And the only thing you have to remember is if you use a collapsible core, you should put the regular plastic core back inside of the film when you send it to the lab, so that the film doesn't accordion in at the lab. Okay, so we got our film set up. Then we want to open this top roller because the film's going to come down through there. And then we're going to put it into the gate. And the one thing you want to make sure of is that the registration pin is open so that you can slide the film underneath of it. Okay, so we pull out approximately 2 feet of film with the perforations facing down, and we put it around the first roller. And you want to make sure you got it in those sprockets on the first roller, and you can kind of feel that if you slide the film just a teeny bit back and forth, and that's in the sprocket. Now we slide it into the gate under the registration pin, trying to keep it so that it matches this little drawing of a loop above it. That's pretty good. And it's underneath of the registration pin, and we can close the pressure pad. Then we want to open this bottom roller while not losing the attachment on the top roller. Slide this film around it, again trying to get it to conform to this drawing in terms of the size of the bottom loop. There we go. So now we got it tight on this one. I'm thinking I'm gonna put one more perforation in there. That's a little bit better in terms of how it matches with the drawing. So now we have our loops formed on the top and bottom, and the film's in the gate. And normally, if you had a daylight spool, you would fold over the end and tuck it into the spool. This is a collapsible spool, so I'm just going to close it like that, and we have nice pressure on the top and the bottom. You can actually, there's 2 little wheels on the outside, which is a good idea every once in a while when you're shooting to check those to make sure that you don't lose this tension on the film. So now we've got the whole thing loaded. Make sure those rollers are tight up against the sprockets, and make sure that the gate is closed. It's always a good idea to just roll it a teeny bit. This particular motor has actually it's an animation mode that allows you to jog the camera 1 frame at a time. And you can see that it's pulling the film and that the loops look pretty good. So let's flip it over to 24 frames per second and make sure that everything's running okay. And that looks great. So now we can put the cover back on and lock it. Give some power to the motor, and you'll see the motor is set at 24 frames per second crystal. This switch actually turns the camera off and on, And this is a lock that allows the camera to be locked on so you don't accidentally turn it off. And if you push it in, it will stop. And the little beep you hear is this particular motor is running at 24 frames per second, and what's happening is it beeps until it gets up to the correct speed. So if you're running and the battery starts getting low, you'll hear the motor make that sound, which means that you have to change the battery and you're not going to be running at 24 frames per second. This motor also stops the mirror in the viewing position, which makes things a lot easier when you're in the middle of production. You look in the camera and you have an image. So that's about it for the 16S. The 16M is a very similar camera, except that it had an external 400-foot mag and it didn't have any internal film capacity. The movements in these cameras, which means that the claw and the pressure plate and the registration pin and the mirror are exactly the same and virtually identical to the 16BL, which came out a few years after this camera. This camera, this particular serial number, is in the 19,000s, so there were a lot of these cameras made, and it was probably one of the most successful cameras that Arriflex ever introduced in its history, and it really launched 16mm as a professional film format. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so we can keep doing more videos like this.